This next story is from the Lakota. I have a good friend. Her name is Joe Lakota, and she's also a storyteller. And her great-great-grandfather rode a buffalo in the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. There was another gentleman in that show named Luther Standing Bear. And as an old man, he wrote down the stories that he remembered from his grandparents. Now think about this for a moment. If you talk to your grandparents about their grandparents, if you talk to your great-grandparents about their great-grandparents, you've gone back hundreds of years. I believe this to be a true story. And I learned it from somebody who heard it from somebody who heard it from somebody who knew this man. It's also in Luther Standing Bear's book, The Stories of the Sioux. Many long years ago, there was a hunter who came riding his pony across the prairie. And as he was riding along, off in the distance, he saw two eagles circling high above him. As he was riding his pony, he was coming back from a successful hunt. He had Wapiti the elk strapped to the back of his pony, and he noticed these two eagles occasionally landed on a ledge on the side of a cliff high above the river. And he thought to himself, wouldn't it be great to have a couple of eagle feathers as a gift that I could give to a friend? Now, one would never kill an eagle to take a feather. And actually today, it's against the law for you to have an eagle feather unless you have a special license or you're a card-carrying American Indian with a permit and that feather is registered. But in those days, and in these days, birds molt. They occasionally shed their feathers. And if you could collect some of those feathers, they are a highly prized gift. You could never purchase one. That is against the law today, and it was unethical then. But if you went above and beyond and risked your life to save a friend, they might give you an eagle feather. So when you see one of those headdresses with a lot of eagle feathers, or a bustle on a fancy dancer, think about every one of those feathers being earned. The great bravery and honor of serving your people. Well, when he got to the base of the cliff, he knew that was too high and a difficult climb. But he knew the lay of the land. He knew if he followed the creek bed, he could get around to the top of the bluff and he'd be closer to that ledge, and that's exactly what he did. He rode his pony up the side of the mountain, up that creek bottom, to the top of the butte, to the top of the mesa. And he could see down below, the eagle's nest wasn't very far. So he took Wapiti, the elk, off the back of his pony, and he skinned the elk. And he took that elk skin, which would be larger than I am, spread out, and he cut a 1-inch strip around the perimeter. And that 1-inch strip, he circled in a spiral all the way in so that from that one elk hide, he would get a really long piece of rope. And then he folded it on itself, so it basically was half its former length, and he twisted both pieces in one direction while wrapping them in the other direction, and that's how you make rope or twine. Now, your belt or your shoes are made of leather, but that's a tanned leather, which is very strong. But this was a green hide, a raw hide. And so he made sure that it was good and thick and well tied to give that extra strength he thought he might need. He wrapped it around the tree twice and tied a knot. He put the other end around his waist, and very slowly, very carefully, he began climbing down the side of that butte. Now, I've done some rock climbing, and I will tell you, climbing down is harder than climbing up because it's hard to see where your feet are going to go. And as he slowly made his way down the side, his rope broke, and he fell, and he landed on the edge of the ledge. If he would have fallen one more foot over, he would have fallen 100 feet to a certain death. And now he was trapped on the edge of this ledge with an eagle's nest and two fledglings, young eagles, just about to learn to fly. Now the mother and the father eagle, when the parents saw him, they attacked. He picked up a stick, not to harm the eagles, but to defend himself and to scare them away. Put yourself in his moccasins. What would you do stranded on such a ledge? This is not a rhetorical question. Take a moment and think about it. Maybe you could turn to a friend and take turns telling what you would do if you were in their shoes. Or you could write the end of this story and come up with your own ideas. Here's what they decided. He took that piece of rope that was still tied around his waist where it had broken, and he untied it. And then he took that length and he cut it in half. He took each half and tied it into a smaller loop. He slipped it over his wrist and twisted it so it was like a figure eight, one on each wrist. And very slowly, very quietly, he crawled towards the two young. He grabbed them by their ankles and he held their feet together so those sharp talons could not harm him. He took that loop of leather and he flipped it over the ankles of each of those young eagles. And then he stood up with an eagle in each hand. He stood to the edge of the ledge, and I would not recommend trying this at home. But he began to move his arms up and down so the eagles began to flap their young wings. And then, yes, he jumped and he began flying straight down really fast. I think you would call it falling. And as long as the eagles flapped, they could not hold up his weight. But as soon as they stopped flapping and those wings stretched out like two parachutes, they caught enough air that they slowed down his fall. He hit the ground quite hard. Oh, nothing broken, a few bruises. But these two young eagles had saved his life. He tucked one under each arm, and then he carried them up the creek bottom back to his pony. Remember, he had an elk. He cut off chunks of meat, and he fed both of those eaglets. And then he took the blanket off his pony, and the rope wrapped around the tree twice. From the tree over to the edge of the ledge, he had enough rope. He tied the four corners of the blanket together like a basket with the two young eagles in it. And leaning over the edge of the ledge, he could lower them down back safely to their nest. Now they say if you see a bird in its nest, you should leave it alone, and that is true. Actually, even if you see a baby bird on the ground, the parent's probably nearby and teaching it how to fly. You should leave it alone. But they also say that if you touch a baby bird or you mess with a baby's nest, your scent is on that nest. Whereas this is true, most birds do not have a sense of smell. So if you see a baby bird and a cat nearby, maybe you want to pick up the baby bird and just put it in a branch and let the parents take care of it from there. But because he had been in the nest, he wasn't sure if the parents would come back. So every day, for several days, he came back and he lowered down meat to feed those baby birds until he was sure that the parents had returned to their responsibility. He still came back every day, and he often fed the parents as well. They'd saved his life. It's the least he could do. And he watched as eventually those two birds learned to fly. Their parents taught them. Or was it their parents? Now that young man, from that day on, whenever he went hunting, if he got wapiti, elk, tatanka, the buffalo, or even maybe just a deer, he would always leave some scraps. And those eagles would often follow him, hoping for those scraps. And from that day on, that young man, he had a new name. He went on to become a great leader among the Lakota. Maybe you've heard of him. His name was Two Eagles. We all fly like eagles, flying so high, circling the universe on wings of pure light. Oh, itchy chai chai, itchy chai oh, oh, itchy chai chai, itchy chai oh.